When we talk about terror, when we talk about the darkest shadows of human history, two names dominate the stage: Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. One is burned into our minds as the ultimate villain, the face of genocide, the orchestrator of the Holocaust. The other, Stalin, is often remembered in a fog. Some see him as the Iron Man of the Soviet Union, the leader who stood against Hitler, the wartime ally who helped defeat fascism. But let's stop right there, because the deeper you dig, the harder it is to avoid the unsettling question. Between Stalin and Hitler, who truly deserves the title of history's greatest architect of terror? It's easy to condemn Hitler. The swastikas, the rallies, the gas chambers, his crimes are visible, undeniable, and universally recognized. Hitler's name has become shorthand for evil itself. But what about Stalin? His terror wasn't as photogenic. It wasn't packaged into cinematic images of concentration camps or iconic World War II battles. His crimes were quieter, more bureaucratic, but no less monstrous. Millions perished in his gulags, starved in forced famines, or disappeared overnight at the hands of his secret police. And yet, Stalin isn't the symbol of evil that Hitler is. Why? Is it because his terror was hidden behind the walls of the Soviet state? Or is it because the world chose to look the other way? This is not just a story about numbers, though the numbers themselves are staggering. Hitler's Holocaust killed 6 million Jews, alongside millions of others deemed undesirable Roma, disabled people, political opponents. Stalin's purges, famines, and gulags killed anywhere from 10 to 20 million, depending on the historian you ask. But here is the question that haunts us. Does the scale of death alone make one man worse than the other? Or is it the design, the intention, the architecture of fear itself that defines the true master of terror? Let's rewind. Stalin rose to power in a society already soaked in blood. The Russian Revolution had torn the empire apart, civil war raged, and chaos was everywhere. Stalin, cunning and ruthless, seized the machinery of power and bent it to his will. Unlike Hitler, who mobilized mass rallies and manipulated ideology in plain sight, Stalin's terror was a shadowy, slow suffocation. People vanished in the night. Entire villages starved not because of nature, but because Stalin's policies turned food into a weapon. He didn't just kill. He engineered silence. Fear was not just a side effect, it was the system itself. And yet, here's the paradox. While Hitler is universally reviled, Stalin is still, in some places, celebrated. Statues of him still stand. Polls in Russia often show him ranked among the most admired leaders in history. How is it that a man who orchestrated mass purges, who created a state of paranoia so suffocating that neighbors betrayed neighbors, could still be romanticized as the strong leader who modernized the Soviet Union? Is this the ultimate success of his terror, that he not only controlled his people, but managed to control his legacy? Meanwhile, Hitler's legacy is frozen in infamy. His regime lasted barely 12 years, yet the mark he left is eternal. His image, his crimes, his ideology, they became the benchmark of horror. We call every tyrant a Hitler when we want to emphasize their evil. But if Stalin's terror was more enduring, more hidden, and more effective at shaping entire generations through fear, should he not be remembered with the same universal disgust? Or does his role in defeating Hitler grant him an undeserved shield in the court of history? This is where the debate begins. Because to truly understand who was the architect of terror, we need to go beyond body counts. We need to ask, who built a system where terror was not just a weapon, but the very foundation of society? Who perfected fear as a science? Who left behind a blueprint that other dictators would later copy? If Hitler was the face of terror, perhaps Stalin was its engineer. And that distinction matters more than we think. So tonight, as we unravel this grim rivalry, I want you to ask yourself, which is worse terror that shocks the world in an instant, or terror so insidious it becomes invisible? Was Hitler truly the monster of the 20th century, or was Stalin the darker shadow hiding behind him? Let's look at how each of these men constructed their terror. Hitler's path was built on spectacle. The Nuremberg rallies, the torchlit parades, the propaganda films, everything was designed to overwhelm the senses and convince the masses that they were part of something transcendent. But spectacle alone doesn't create terror. What truly marked Hitler's reign was his obsession with categorizing humanity: who deserves to live, who deserves to die, and who must be erased from existence. It was a cold, calculated bureaucracy of extermination. Every step of the Holocaust was documented, organized, industrialized. Trains ran on schedules, camps functioned like machines, and murder became a routine task for the Nazi state. It was terror that you could see, terror that could not be denied. Now, contrast that with Stalin. He didn't rely on rallies or public displays of hatred to enforce his rule. Instead, he created a fog of paranoia that spread across the Soviet Union like a poison gas. Anyone could be an enemy, your colleague, your friend, even your own family. Neighbors whispered, and whispers became accusations. People vanished in the middle of the night, taken by the NKVD, never to be seen again. Sometimes there wasn't even a reason. Sometimes the only crime was being unlucky enough to be noticed. And the most terrifying part, the system didn't just kill, it forced the living to participate. Sons denounced fathers, wives betrayed husbands, not because they hated them, but because not betraying them meant sharing their fate. Stalin didn't just build a system of terror. He turned society itself into a weapon. Think about that for a moment. Hitler made you fear being part of the wrong group: Jew, Roma, political dissenter. Stalin made you fear being human. Under Hitler, terror was directed outward. Under Stalin, terror was turned inward, like a cancer eating its own people from within. Which is worse? The slaughter of those deemed outsiders, or the destruction of trust between every individual in a nation? And yet, history remembers them differently. Hitler's crimes were uncovered in full view. The liberation of the concentration camps left the world with photographs, with testimonies, with undeniable evidence. The horror was documented in blood and ash. Stalin's crimes, however, were buried behind the Iron Curtain. Western journalists were often fooled or silenced. Official Soviet statistics were doctored, censored, rewritten. The famines in Ukraine, the millions who starved to death, were dismissed as crop failures. The gulags were explained away as prisons for enemies of the state. Even decades later, when the archives opened, the true scale of Stalin's terror was still disputed. And this raises the question: is a crime less evil because it's less visible? Or is invisibility itself the perfection of terror? Let's dig deeper into intention. Hitler's terror was rooted in ideology. He believed in a twisted worldview that demanded the elimination of entire groups. His terror was genocidal by design. It was meant to cleanse, to destroy, to annihilate. Stalin's terror, on the other hand, was less about ideology and more about power. He wasn't trying to exterminate a race. He was trying to exterminate opposition, real or imagined. His terror was surgical, though no less bloody. He eliminated anyone who might challenge his rule. He turned famine into a tool to crush resistance in Ukraine. He staged show trials, not to prove guilt, but to demonstrate that guilt didn't matter. Under Stalin, innocence was irrelevant. Survival depended on obedience, and even that was never guaranteed. Which system of terror cuts deeper, the one driven by ideology, or the one driven by paranoia? The chilling truth is that both were architects, but they built very different structures. Hitler built a house of firebright, violent, and short-lived. It consumed everything in its path, but eventually burned out, leaving only ashes. Stalin built a house of ice-slow, cold, and enduring. His system froze society, suffocated it, and preserved terror for generations. People under Hitler lived in fear of the war, ending in defeat. People under Stalin lived in fear even in peacetime, because peace didn't mean safety. Terror was the air they breathed. And here is where the debate becomes uncomfortable. Because when we think of Hitler, we think of defeat. The Allies crushed him. His ideology was discredited. His name is synonymous with evil, and rightly so. But when we think of Stalin, we also have to think of victory. He was on the winning side of World War II. His tanks rolled into Berlin. His flag was raised over the Reichstag. He became one of the big three alongside Roosevelt and Churchill, celebrated as the leader who helped save Europe from fascism. And in that moment, his terror was overlooked, even excused. How do you condemn a man who stood against Hitler while you still needed him? Did the war itself protect Stalin's legacy? Did Hitler as monstrosity act as a shield that allowed Stalin to hide his own crimes in plain sight? This is the great irony of history. Hitler's evil was so loud, so undeniable, that it drowned out Stalin's quieter, but equally devastating terror. And maybe, just maybe, that was Stalin's greatest victory, not his conquest of territory, not his industrialization of Russia, but his ability to commit mass murder while history hesitated to call him the monster he truly was. When you peel back the layers of both regimes, one word keeps returning: design. Neither Hitler nor Stalin ruled by accident. Their terror wasn't spontaneous chaos. It was intentional, structured, engineered. But the blueprints were different. Hitler engineered genocide. Stalin engineered paranoia. And to ask which was worse is not just an exercise in history. It is an uncomfortable mirror reflecting how societies can be destroyed from the inside. Take Stalin's Great Purge, for example. Imagine living in Moscow in the 1930s. Every night, black cars of the NKVD patrol the streets. You hear them stop outside, the knock on the door, the muffled cries of neighbors being taken away. You don't ask questions, because asking is dangerous. You don't speak their names again, because remembering them might brand you an enemy. Soon, you stop trusting everyone, even your own children, because in Stalin's Soviet Union, children were encouraged to denounce their parents to prove loyalty to the state. Fear wasn't just external. It seeped into every relationship, poisoning love, friendship, family. Stalin built a world where betrayal was survival. Is that not the ultimate architecture of terror? Now compare this with Hitler's Germany. The terror was visible and communal. Jews were stripped of rights in broad daylight, forced to wear stars on their clothing, rounded up into ghettos, deported in full view. Neighbors saw it, knew it, and participated, sometimes out of belief, sometimes out of fear. Hitler didn't need to make his terror invisible. He needed it to be public, to normalize atrocity, to make millions complicit in genocide. His architecture of terror relied on consensus, on a society willing to look away or even cheer. Stalin's relied on silence. Hitler weaponized hate. Stalin weaponized fear. Which is the greater evil, hate that burns outward, or fear that rots inward? And let's not forget famine, Stalin's most chilling tool. The Holodomor in Ukraine wasn't a natural disaster. It was engineered starvation. Grain was seized. Villages were surrounded. Food was confiscated, even from starving families. Millions wasted away, while trains full of grain were shipped out for export. Hitler starved his enemies in occupied territories. Stalin starved his own citizens. Can a leader who deliberately uses hunger as a weapon against his own people ever be remembered as anything other than an architect of terror? Here's the deeper question. Why does Stalin still escape the universal condemnation that Hitler receives? Part of the answer lies in propaganda. Stalin controlled the narrative masterfully. He presented himself as the father of the Soviet people, the industrializer who dragged Russia into the modern age, the strong man who defeated fascism. And for decades, even after his death, this image lingered. Hitler had no such luxury. His crimes were exposed in real time, his regime annihilated, his body reduced to ashes in a bunker. There was no rehabilitation, no myth left to cling to. But Stalin's myth endured, because terror didn't just eliminate opposition, it erased the evidence. And this brings us to the heart of the debate. Terror is not only about killing, terror is about memory. Hitler's terror left scars so visible that the world could never forget. Stalin's terror left wounds so hidden that even his victims often could not speak of them. Survivors of gulags remained silent for decades, too broken, too fearful, or too erased by history. Hitler created martyrs and monuments to atrocity. Stalin created ghosts. Which is worse, to be remembered in horror or to vanish into silence? Consider also the global impact. Hitler's crimes were used as justification for a new world order, the Nuremberg trials, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the very idea of never again. His terror reshaped international law. Stalin's crimes, by contrast, were swallowed by the Cold War. Western powers, unwilling to confront their recent ally, downplayed the horrors. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, used victory over Hitler as a shield against criticism. The result? Hitler became the lesson. Stalin became the omission. And in that omission, millions of deaths lost their voice. Should we not call that a second crime? There is another uncomfortable truth here. Hitler's terror was so extreme, so grotesque, that it's easy to separate ourselves from it. We look at the Holocaust and say, that was evil, that was inhuman, that could never happen again. But Stalin's terror? It feels more familiar. The paranoia, the fear of speaking out, the idea that loyalty to the state overrides personal morality, these are not alien concepts. They appear in shades and echoes, in different forms across many societies, even today. Maybe that's why we resist putting Stalin on the same level as Hitler. Because admitting his terror was just as monstrous forces us to admit how easily such a system could rise again, anywhere. So ask yourself this. If Hitler is remembered because he was defeated, and Stalin is half forgotten because he was victorious, what does that say about how we measure evil? Do we judge by the number of victims, the method of terror, or the legacy left behind? And if legacy is the measure, doesn't Stalin's enduring image as a strong leader prove that his terror was more effective, more insidious, and more dangerous in the long run? Let's talk about complicity. Terror on this scale cannot function without participation. Neither Hitler nor Stalin acted alone. But the way they made ordinary people complicit tells us something about their different blueprints of fear. Hitler mobilized belief. Millions bought into the idea of racial purity, into the myth of the Aryan nation, into the fantasy that destroying others would build a better world. His terror depended on indoctrination, on convincing an entire society that atrocity was necessary. Stalin, on the other hand, mobilized fear. He didn't need people to believe in his ideology. He needed them to be afraid of questioning it. Under Hitler, terror was a twisted faith. Under Stalin, terror was a suffocating silence. Which system is harder to resist, the one that seduces you or the one that strangles you? The human cost of this difference is staggering. In Nazi Germany, Jews and other targeted groups became scapegoats for everything wrong in society. Hatred gave the regime its focus. In Stalin's Russia, the targets shifted constantly. One year it was political opponents, the next it was generals, then intellectuals, then ordinary workers accused of sabotage. No one was safe, because safety itself would undermine terror. Stalin understood something chilling. Terror works best when it is unpredictable. Hitler's victims could at least identify why they were targeted, even if the reason was monstrous. Stalin's victims never knew. Innocence offered no protection. Guilt was irrelevant. Terror became random, and randomness is its own form of torture. And yet, even in their cruelty, both men had moments when their strategies overlapped. Hitler's Gestapo inspired fear through surveillance, denunciations, and suspicion. Stalin's NKVD mirrored the same techniques, but on an even wider scale. Both leaders created a culture where betrayal became normal, where loyalty to the state mattered more than loyalty to blood. Both built systems that turned ordinary citizens into instruments of oppression. But again, the distinction matters. Hitler's terror was aimed outward, against the other. Stalin's terror devoured his own people. One regime sought purity through elimination. The other sought absolute power through destruction of trust. Here's another layer we rarely discuss: legacy of terror. Hitler's Reich ended in ruins, his empire collapsing in flames, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. No one denies the Holocaust. It is remembered, documented, taught in schools, immortalized in museums. Stalin's terror, by contrast, left behind a Soviet Union that endured for decades. His successors didn't erase his system. They inherited it, modified it, and continued it. The KGB was born from Stalin's NKVD. The culture of silence, fear, and censorship outlived him. Even after his death, his shadow lingered, shaping generations. Terror that ends in defeat leaves memory. Terror that ends in continuity leaves normalization. Which is more dangerous? Now think about perception. Ask anyone in the West who was the ultimate villain of the 20th century, and the answer will almost always be Hitler. But ask in parts of Russia, and you'll hear a different story. Stalin is remembered by some not as a monster, but as a strong leader, a necessary evil, even a national hero. This distortion of memory is perhaps the most chilling proof of his effectiveness. Hitler is universally hated. Stalin remains contested. That is not an accident. It is part of his architecture of terror, carried forward by propaganda, myth-making, and the silence of survivors. What does it mean when a dictator can kill millions and still be admired decades later? Isn't that the true victory of fear? Let's not forget the global stage. Hitler reshaped the world through destruction. Stalin reshaped it through survival. Hitler's defeat united the world against fascism. Stalin's victory entrenched communism as a global power, spreading his model of governance to Eastern Europe, Asia, and beyond. Hitler's ideology died in a bunker. Stalin's lived on in Mao's China, in North Korea, in every dictatorship that learned to weaponize paranoia as a tool of control. If we measure terror by the systems it inspires, then Stalin's shadow stretches far wider than Hitler's ever did. But here is the part that forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. We need villains we can recognize. Hitler provides that. His crimes are clear. His symbols are infamous. His evil is undeniable. He is the face of horror. Stalin, on the other hand, forces us to confront the banality of evil. His terror wasn't cinematic. It was paperwork, bureaucrats, quiet arrests, starvation policies, forged statistics. It was death by neglect, by silence, by fear itself. And that makes it harder to face, harder to condemn, because it looks less like a nightmare, and more like something any government, anywhere, could replicate under the right conditions. Doesn't that make Stalin's model even more dangerous for the future? So here's the question that lingers. When we compare Stalin and Hitler, are we asking the wrong thing? It's not just about who killed more or who was more cruel. It's about who left behind a template of terror that still lives today. Hitler's legacy is a warning. Stalin's legacy is a possibility. And possibilities are far more terrifying than warnings. If terror is measured by death tolls, some historians will argue Stalin killed more. If terror is measured by cruelty of method, Hitler's Holocaust remains unparalleled in its deliberate dehumanization. But maybe the real measure is not death itself, it's what the terror left behind. Hitler's terror ended with a world united in disgust, with trials and memorials, with a commitment, however imperfect, to never let it happen again. Stalin's terror ended with silence, denial, and in some places, admiration. Which is worse, evil that the world condemns, or evil that the world excuses? Let's consider the psychology of both systems. Hitler offered his people certainty. He told them who the enemy was, and he built a machine of hatred around that certainty. Stalin offered only uncertainty. You never knew when the knock on the door would come, who would betray you, or what imaginary crime you had committed. Hitler's Germany created victims who could tell their stories after liberation. Stalin's Russia created survivors who often stayed silent because speaking was still dangerous, even decades later. Which terror cuts deeper, the one that scars memory, or the one that erases it? And what about morality? It is easy for us to say Hitler was the greater monster. It absolves us of responsibility. We can say, he was unique, a singular evil, something humanity has learned from. But to say Stalin was just as bad, or perhaps worse, forces us to confront the fact that his model of control is not unique. It is repeatable. It is adaptable. It doesn't rely on racial ideology or world wars. It relies on fear, bureaucracy, and silence. And those tools are available to any state, anywhere, at any time. Isn't that the more frightening possibility? The most dangerous dictators are not the ones who burn brightly and die in flames. They are the ones who create systems that outlive them. Stalin's terror became the Soviet Union's DNA. His paranoia shaped the Cold War. His methods shaped regimes across the globe. His shadow lingers even today in places where speaking truth is still a crime. Hitler's terror, for all its brutality, was annihilated with his defeat. Stalin's terror mutated, adapted, and survived. If we measure terror by endurance, Stalin's victory is undeniable. But here is the twist. Does survival make his terror worse, or does visibility make Hitler's crimes more horrifying? Maybe the real question is not who was worse, but who taught us more about the nature of evil. Hitler showed us how ideology can turn a society into executioners. Stalin showed us how power can turn a society into prisoners of their own fear. Hitler was the fire. Stalin was the ice. Which one do you fear more? And maybe, just maybe, this is why the debate will never end. Because choosing between Stalin and Hitler as the true architect of terror is like choosing between two nightmares. One devoured its victims with rage, the other with silence. One was condemned, the other partially excused. Both left behind lessons that we are still failing to learn. And so the question remains, when we think of terror, when we think of the blueprint of fear, who do we truly crown as the master? The monster we all know, or the one who still hides in the shadows of history? So I'll leave it to you. In the court of human memory, who was the real architect of terror, Hitler, the face of evil, or Stalin, the shadow that still haunts us?